On Sunday evenings, we're looking through the life of David, and last time we saw the various attempts of King Saul to have David killed because of his envy for the younger man. He offered David the hand of his daughter in marriage if he would kill 100 Philistines, hoping that the Philistines would kill him instead. But David slew 200 Philistines and married the princess Michal. So now he's a member of the royal family. But Saul's hatred for David gets even worse now that he's his son-in-law. And the 19th chapter that we're looking at tonight, 1 Samuel, it's about more attempts made by Saul on David's life and how the Lord protected him. The chapter opens up by Saul holding a meeting with his servants in a conspiracy to kill David. Saul's son Jonathan was amongst them, and we're told that he delighted much in David. It seems though Saul couldn't keep his hatred of David to himself. He just had to share it with others. But this led to the failure of his plans because Jonathan's love for David and his realization that David was innocent made Jonathan decide to help him. So he's determined that he would inform David about the conspiracy against him. It was strange that Saul should uncover his malice like he did when there was no reason for it. He knew that Jonathan liked David, but as he saw it, he hoped that Jonathan would have the sense to see that he was likely to lose out by David's success just as much as Saul himself. Surely the fact that Jonathan might lose his position as heir to the throne because of David would be enough to make him want to get David out of the way. Saul didn't realise that Christian love wants the best for other people and seeketh not her own. He believed that the members of a family, this is Saul believed that the members of a family should close ranks and all fight for one another, whether their cause is right or wrong. But that's all part of the corrupt human nature that is within people. They'd rather take the side of their loved one, even when they know their loved one's in the wrong, than take the side of those who are in the right. You can even see this in children. They claim that somebody's hit their brother, so that entitles them to go off and fight with that person. But Jonathan's not like that. If he had to decide between helping his father to do evil or going against his father to do what was right, he'd choose the latter. He would trust in God and do the right. Yes, we are to honour our father and mother, but that doesn't mean helping them to sin. That would be to dishonour them. If Jonathan had have helped his father to kill David, he would actually be hurting his father because Saul would have been greatly punished by God for it. And anyway, Jonathan had made a covenant with David, and this meant that they would go to each other's defence if necessary. So Jonathan had to keep his side of the covenant. He was a real good friend to David, and a friend in need is a friend indeed. So he tells David about the conspiracy and how that he ought to go and hide himself. He also assures him that he will have a serious talk with his father and stand up for David and try to get Saul to change his mind. And then he would report back to David and tell him what his father had said. And he says, I'm going to do this in the morning, after Saul's had time to sleep on it and possibly awaken a better frame of mind. And this is what Jonathan does in verse 4. He speaks good of David, even though he risks Saul's anger falling on him. He says that it would be a sin on David's part, a sin on Saul's part to hurt David. After all, David had done him no wrong. Indeed, he'd done him a lot of good. It wasn't for David, there was a distinct possibility that Saul would no longer be king or not even be alive, because Goliath would have won the day against the Israelites and Saul may have been slain. But how like today? It's the person who does the most for somebody who is so little appreciated, and when things go wrong, they're the ones who get the blame. Jonathan says, don't sin against David because he hasn't done anything against you. He hasn't sinned against you. His works have been very good towards you. How can you pay him back with evil? So he's showing his father how unjust he was. And of course there's always been a lot of injustice in the world, and there still is today. There are very few people who would do what Jonathan is doing here. There are plenty of people who are prepared to stand up for themselves, but where are the people who are prepared to stand up for somebody else? When somebody's being run down behind their back, there are three different responses that people can make. The first one is to simply join in with the criticism. The second one is to say nothing. And the third one is to stand up for the person who's being criticised. And each one is progressively harder to do. But that's where our Christian love is tested. And of course it's even more tested when Christ is the person who's being spoken badly of. When you hear Christ being run down, do we stand up for him? Or do we say nothing? Now in verse 5, Jonathan reminds his father that David had risked his life when he took on Goliath. He put his life in his hand, he says, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. And Father, you were there to see it. You saw it with your own eyes. And you rejoiced in it at the time. You could see God's hand in it like the rest of us could. How can you think of killing the man that God so mightily used? Is there not a chance that you'll be fighting against God and doing the nation a great deal of harm? If you slay David, it will be without a cause, and you'll be shedding innocent blood. You talk about what's best for our family. Shedding innocent blood is not what's best for our family. It will come back on us and we will lose out. Well, Jonathan did very well in what he said, not only from the point of view of his love and courage, but also regarding common sense and good advice. His petition on David's behalf was well reasoned, and even Saul could see the truth of it. Indeed, he says that he hearkened to the voice of Jonathan. He took notice of it, and he realised that he was in the wrong, that he'd been very foolish. So here is scripture to show that sometimes parents can be wrong and their son or daughter be right. And parents ought to be humble enough to realise that their son or daughter could be the one in the right and they could learn from them. Saul was so moved by Jonathan's reasoning that in verse 6 he makes an oath and says, "As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain." Amazing words these are. We've already seen the value of Saul's promises, like when he promised to give his daughter Merab to David if he won the battle. But then he gave her to another man instead. Now we're going to learn the value of Saul's oaths, because he took an oath in God's name, but this was to take God's name in vain, for later on he did try and kill David many times. The probability is that he meant what he said at the time. He didn't intend to hurt David then. But the whole purpose of making an oath is to bind yourself to it in the future, and you dare not go back on it. It's like when people make their marriage vows. It's no good saying 10 years afterwards, well, I know I'm breaking those vows now, but I meant it at the time. The whole point of a vow is that it's binding on you in the future. People are often quick to use God's name to back up what they say, but they often break the third commandment by saying it. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for God will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Anyway, Jonathan reported back to David that his father had had a change of heart and that he'd made an oath in God's name to spare him. And with this he was able to get David to agree to return to Saul in the palace and continue in his service. But it wasn't long after this that war broke out again with the Philistines, and David led his soldiers out to fight against them and gained yet another great victory. You'll notice that even though David had been wronged by Saul time and time again, he doesn't think of giving up his service for him. And that's an example that Christians need to follow, because there's always a temptation when you receive evil for good to pack up doing the good. We must not get weary in well-doing. We must not pull out of our Christian duty because we're not appreciated. David may not have been rewarded by Saul, but he was rewarded by God. And so it is with the Christian. That person we seek to help may not reward us or even say thank you, but our reward comes from God, and the Lord is a good master. He pays good wages, and nobody ever lost out by serving him. Now, having beaten the Philistines once again, David returned to the palace, and we're told that the evil spirit came upon Saul again. Notice carefully the first word of verse 9, the word "and," because that links the two verses together. The point being that David's great victory in verse 8 actually led to an evil spirit coming upon Saul in verse 9. How could that be? Well, you see, Saul wasn't against David because he did any wrong, or because he let him down, or because he made mistakes. He was against him because he did well. If David had been a failure, then Saul would have loved him. Indeed, when he first came to the palace as a shepherd boy, Saul did love him greatly. But it was David's success that got Saul down. And when he got depressed like that, this evil spirit came upon him. Saul was in such a bad way now that every time David went out to fight against the Philistines, he wanted David to lose. He wanted his own nation of Israel to lose the battle and the Philistines to win, because he hated David so much. Any time he felt that David wasn't getting on too well, Saul became quite happy within himself. But whenever David prospered or won a battle, this led Saul to be depressed. The lesson from that is quite simple, isn't it? That when you are envious of somebody, you leave yourself wide open to an attack by the devil. When David returned to the palace, he found Saul in this unhappy, restless state, so he plays the harp for him again. Perhaps he was a little apprehensive as Saul was sat there with a javelin in his hand like he'd been before. Perhaps David could have argued that now he's an army captain, he shouldn't be expected to do such a menial job as playing the harp. But no, he carries out Saul's wishes, although no doubt he kept a wary eye open and trusted God to keep him safe now like he would in the battle. David felt he was in as dangerous a position now in the palace as he was out in the battlefield. And verse 10 tells us that once again Saul tried to murder David. We're told that he threw the javelin at him in an attempt to nail him to the wall. He tried to do that before, and now he's doing it again. But once more David was able to escape from him. There is an amazing sowing and reaping in all this. The very last few verses of this book of Samuel, we're told that after Saul had committed suicide, the Philistines fastened his body to the wall. They fastened his body to the wall. So they did to him what he tried to do to David. What a warning that should be to anybody who deliberately tries to hurt somebody else. So strong was the evil spirit upon Saul, and so full of envy was him, that his rage got the better of him, and his oath in God's name not to slay David is quickly broken. He'd said not long before this, "As the Lord liveth, David shall not be slain," and now he's taking up a javelin to try and do that. And he pictures here ungodly people who've been convicted about their sinfulness and who promise to turn over a new leaf and not to do such things anymore, but soon afterwards they go back on their promise and begin to do the same thing again. As Peter puts it in the New Testament, they're like a dog returning to its vomit. Do you know there are plenty of people in prison tonight who are genuinely sorry because of the crimes they committed? But it's only because they got caught and now they're being punished. It's only when people are sorry towards God and realised they'd done wrong in his sight, that there can be true repentance and therefore true forgiveness. Anyway, God's protection continued upon David. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth them. And that's what happened to David. He was able to get away to his own home during the night. Having recently got married, David now lived with his wife Michal in a home of his own, as opposed to being in the palace or being in his father Jesse's house. But Saul was able to find out that David had gone back to his home, and he sent men after him to lay wait for him so as to assassinate him the next day. During that same night, David wrote the 59th Psalm, the title of which actually says, "When Saul sent and they watched the house to slay him." And David says in that psalm, "Deliver me from mine enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity. Save me from bloody men, for they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me, not for my transgression, nor for my sin, O Lord." And the Lord answered that prayer. For what Saul proposed, God disposed. For having used Saul's son, Jonathan, to save David previously, now he was going to use Saul's daughter, Michal, to save him this time. Somehow she'd learned that her father had this plan to send soldiers to the house to kill her husband. Perhaps Saul thought that his daughter would be on his side, as before he thought that his son would be on his side. But both Jonathan and Michal truly loved David, and they would do what they could to help him. So Michal says to David at the end of verse 11, he'd better get away during the night, for it'd be too late if he left it till the morning. Saul had hoped that his daughter would be a snare to David, but she turned out to be his protector. She let him down by the side of the house, presumably in some sort of basket on a rope, like Rahab had once done with the spies, you remember? Or like in the New Testament, some Christians would do when the Apostle Paul came to Damascus. When David had slipped away, Michal then took an image of some sort, just something around the house, something at random, something which would be similar to David's size, and she laid it in their bed so as to make it look as though David was in the bed. And then in the morning, when Saul's men came to the house to get David, she showed them the bed and said that her husband was sick. Michal is to be commended for helping her husband like this, but perhaps not for telling a lie. For the Lord can protect his people without the need of lies. But only a Christian with great faith could be like this in a time of crisis. Saul's men showed some humanity. They didn't like the idea of murdering a sick man in his bed, so they returned to Saul and told him about it. And this gave David time to get further away. But Saul insisted that his men return to the house and bring David in his bed so that he could slay him. How incredibly low Saul had now sunk. When he first became king, you probably don't remember the story, when he first became king as a young man, some people were very nasty to him. And it was suggested to him that he go and slay those people. But he said no, he wanted to be gracious. Look what he's like now. Isn't it fearful when you consider how much he changed? And that's a warning to Christians as they get older to make sure they don't get sour and embittered. Anyway, the servants go back to David's house and find to their surprise that it's not a sick man in the bed, but something made to look like him. And again they report this back to Saul. When the king heard about it, he sent for Michal and remonstrated with her for telling lies and deceiving him and allowing David to get away. And she replied by telling another lie, saying that David had said that he would kill her if she didn't help him escape? This time they were both wrong. Saul was wrong in expecting his daughter to help him in the murder of her husband. Indeed, a person's first loyalty under God is to the person they're married to. The person they're married to should be closer to them than their parents. How crazy had Saul become in saying that his daughter had done wrong in not trying to help murder her husband who was innocent? But alas, Michal was also wrong, not only for telling a lie, but also by harming David's reputation, as if he would have threatened to murder his wife. But then wives must always be very careful as to what they say about their husbands, because there may be people who are only too eager to think the worst of them. But there was something else here as well. For Michal had put the image in the bed after David had gone, so if she'd have wanted to, she could have gone and seen her father then and told him that David had gone. But the fact that she didn't do that showed that she was on her husband's side, and the excuse that she made was a lie. Saul was concerned about the mote in Michal's eye, but not about the beam that was in his own eye. And we can see here proof, sad proof, of what we saw last time, that Michal loved David a great deal, but she didn't love God. And Saul describes David here as his enemy, yet never once had David ever done anything against him. Do you know, in the New Testament was a whole church who regarded the Apostle Paul as their enemy, simply because he told them the truth. It all shows that often when people regard those as their enemies who stand in their way to prevent them from doing evil. Somebody's bent on doing evil and somebody tries to stop them and they say, "You're my enemy." We can also see in this event how that David was treated badly by both friend and foe. And this pictured the son of David, who suffered in the same way. For his disciples let him down in his hour of need, just when his enemies had come to arrest him. In verse 18, David, having escaped from Saul and his men, he goes to a place called Ramah, where Samuel lived. And there he told the prophet of all that Saul had done against him. It's significant that he didn't go to his father Jesse in Bethlehem, and he didn't go to one of those cities where he'd been praised so much. You know, David has slain his tens of thousands. He could have gone there and got protection and got sympathy. But David wanted more than that. He wanted guidance from God. He wanted the man who had originally been sent to anoint him to be the next king, to pray for him now that he was in trouble. He wanted Samuel to confirm that his calling was still in force. As far as David could see, he'd behaved himself wisely and done all the right things, yet he got nothing but trouble for it. So had he made some sort of mistake? Had he gone wrong in some way? And isn't this the experience of some Christians? They sought to do the will of God, but they seem to have got loads of trouble because of it. And they begin to wonder if they've made a mistake. Should they try something different? Indeed, things can be so much against them at times that they begin to start wondering if the Lord still loves them. As if they think that God has blessed other Christians, but he seems to have passed them over. But just like David was in the will of God and would eventually become king and finish higher up than anybody, so the downcast Christian is in the will of God, and the Lord loves them greatly, even though their present circumstances may seem to suggest that he doesn't. And they will finish up on top, and one day they'll see the reason for why they were led in such a strange way. Certainly what the discouraged Christian needs a lot of is good Christian fellowship. And that's why David goes to Samuel. Samuel, remember, was involved with the school of the prophets. And David could have joined with them in singing God's praise. How lovely. And that would have encouraged him in the Lord. He later wrote in Psalm 27, "One thing I desired from the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he will hide me in his pavilion." And so David kept his mind on God at this critical time, where Saul had turned his back on God. Saul had made an oath that he wouldn't try and kill David, but he'd broken that over and over again. I just wonder if there's somebody listening to me tonight, maybe here or maybe elsewhere, somebody listening to me, somebody who's gone back on their word, because that's the context of this, or somebody who's thinking about doing that, and the Lord is saying to them that having made a promise, they must keep it. Let us all learn from this passage this evening that many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of them all. The devil may be causing one trouble after another, attacking a Christian on this side and then on that side, but it's all an attempt on his part to drive a wedge between the Christian and God, to make the Christian leave the God they love. But by keeping our faith in God, he will deliver us in a time of trouble, so that we may be able to withstand all the fiery darts of the evil one. All glory to God's name. Amen.